those years were just incredible for me as I was learning so much and climbing with my friends and also having success with my clients. But during that time as well, I think I went through the icefall, the Khumbu icefall, which is kind of the most dangerous section of the mountain on the south side. I went through it 38 times. Two times, I felt like I legitimately was close to not coming home because of accidents in the icefall that I was involved in. And I think I helped dig out bodies three times in the icefall over those 38 times or over those years on that side. And that was something that constantly weighed on me. Hello and welcome to the Duffel Shuffle. I'm Adrian Ballinger, and we're here to discuss the world of climbing and skiing in all its forms through the eyes of mountain guides.
And I'm Sam Kiekeffer. In each episode, we'll unpack exhilarating stories, share invaluable insights, and get up close and personal with some of the most experienced and passionate guides and athletes in the industry.
Whether you're a seasoned alpinist or a weekend warrior, the Duffel Shuffle is your ticket to the thrilling world of climbing, skiing, and mountaineering. Join us.
All right, welcome back. Episode 4. Adrian, you're in a different location than you've recorded from before. Where are you?
Yes, it's very yellow here. I don't know whether it's good for the video. For the YouTube watchers out there of the Duffel Shuffle, I am at 17,200 feet on the north side of Mount Everest in Tibet, China. So, base camp.
Awesome. We hope to bring an episode from Everest Base Camp, and here we are, episode 4. So we'll dive right in. We kind of wanted to get an update from you, Adrian, on north side of Mount Everest. It's the first time that you've been back to Mount Everest since COVID started in 2020, and I know a lot has changed. Would love to kind of just hear from you about what it's like being back on the north side of Mount Everest and your feelings and what's going on over on Mount Everest and with the news around Everest.
Yeah, I mean, start with just how excited I am to be here. I think it's hard to overstate my stoke. So that'll probably come through over the next few minutes as we speak. It's been since 2019, since 2020 was canceled for COVID. So 5 years since I and my team have been here, since we feel so strongly that the South Side is not currently like a place we can ethically or safely guide our clients. We just haven't been able to come back to Everest for years. And so it just feels incredible to be here. There's a second side benefit of this season that because it's been so difficult and challenging to get back into Tibet and China as foreign climbers, there's almost no one here. If I had to guess, all in foreign climbers and Sherpa, there's less than 100 people on the mountain on this side. And there's probably a little over 1,000 on the other side. And it's not even really about comparing sides. It's just about like, this is what the mountain probably felt like back in the 80s when it was only national teams coming to the mountain. Every day we've been going on acclimatization hikes up to 20,000 feet around base camp. And literally it feels like there's not a soul within hundreds of miles. You can just go wherever you want, climb to 20,000 feet in your sneakers and be all alone. And so I'm sure we'll dive into a little bit some of the challenges of getting here. Like it has been a very painful process to get here. It's been a little bit stressful and I haven't slept a whole lot for a few weeks, but now being here and experiencing this, it's like this just lifetime thing that I didn't know that I'd ever experience. I've never seen Mount Everest like this. And so, yeah, everyone on the team is just out of control, excited for what we're experiencing each day.
And so just to be clear, you've been climbing on the north side of Mount Everest for, many, many seasons now, and it's quieter than it's ever been by a long shot. And so even though the south side is notably busier on average, the north side is just remarkably quiet.
Yeah, that's right. The last few years before COVID, we were seeing somewhere in the vicinity of 100 to 150 foreign climbers supported by 150 Tibetan or Nepali climbers. So, we were up in that 300 number. And this year we're definitely less than 100 all in. So this is a truly unique year. And, I'm pretty excited for the people who did choose to join us this year because they took a risk. They took a risk that China and Tibet would not open to foreign climbers. Hasn't been open for 4 years. There was a lot of challenges getting visas and invitation letters, and we even had to delay our season 1 week because the border didn't open. And so the climbers who chose to push through that took a real risk of their entire Everest season. But the payoff is now seeing the mountain in a way that I don't think we haven't seen in 20 years, and I don't think we will see again in the next 20.
Wow. And how about infrastructure? I know, China's been putting a lot of effort into the north side of Mount Everest, and the infrastructure between Lhasa and base camp has seen a lot of change in past years. Have you noticed a change having not been there in 5 years now?
Yeah, for sure. And in sort of some positives and some like challenges or negatives there. The positives, the infrastructure getting to base camp continues to get better and better. The quality of hotels is almost getting a little like ridiculous. We're staying in like 5-star St. Regis hotels and Hiltons and things like that with just like fantastic food and amazing bathrooms and like way better showers than I have in my house in Tahoe. And so it's a little bit of a unique feel to be so luxurious, but this is the infrastructure that China is building primarily for Chinese tourists to come to Everest base camp only. So Mount Everest on the Tibetan side is now a national park. So imagine it's their version of the Grand Canyon or perhaps Yellowstone. They expect it to be one of the most visited sites in China one day with millions and millions of tourists. And so they're building everything from high-speed trains to get to close to base camp to, even though we're driving on a perfectly paved 2-lane highway currently, they're now putting in a new, looks like 4-lane highway. Um, and the hotels are improving. There's a new airport going in, the Tingri International Airport, which will be less than 2 hours from base camp. And it looks like we're going to be able to fly into there and skip 3 days of driving in the upcoming years. Um, so the infrastructure, I think it's easy at home to be like, we shouldn't have this infrastructure on Mount Everest. But actually, to me, a tourism industry and infrastructure that can handle things like the human waste, the sewage from millions of tourists and the impact, China is thinking very carefully about how to do that, as because they recognize this is a place that their 1 billion citizens want to go and see one day. It's a dream trip. Now, the
Yeah.
interesting thing is, as soon as we get to all of that is stopped about 20 minutes from base camp, and it's a hard line. It's not like on the Nepal side where tourists can get into base camp. Here, there's no access to base camp for tourists. So they can see this incredible monastery. There's incredible viewpoints. There's a museum to Everest history being built. There's new hotels being built, even all the way up at 17,000 feet. But as soon as you cross this line, it's only climbers in this 2 mile long by mile wide valley where we've built base camp. And there's only 100 people here, and it takes me 10 minutes to walk to my next closest camp. And so it feels remote. And it seems like that's China's decision. They're going to keep the mountain pristine, quiet, and very difficult to climb. And then they're going to dramatically increase infrastructure for tourism to before base camp.
Wow. So sounds like they're making it quite easy to get there. You had some challenges though.
Yeah,
Obviously,
easy and yet
your trip was
impossible.
delayed. Yeah.
I mean, I think
Your
the
trip.
reality is, and I think we'll see changes in this over time, but right now, it seems very clear to me that China is focusing on domestic tourism, and they're really slowly opening back up to the rest of the world. But so Tibet is still a sensitive region. It's called the Tibet Autonomous Region. Um, we all know the history of Tibet, I'm sure. And so being a foreigner allowed into Tibet is still very challenging. Um, so for us, that meant, you choose the timeline: 4 years of trying to get back into Tibet, or a year of dedicated working with the Chinese to get permits, or, the last month of just nonstop negotiations of how it was going to work and what it was going to look like. And it was all the way down to the wire where they asked us to push 7 days so they could do 7 days more of work of like how this was going to work. And the only reason that 7 day delay really worked for Alpenglow is because of our rapid ascent system and kind of the excellent logistics we know we can lean on, so that we were able to say, okay, we'll wait a week, we'll keep acclimatizing, and we'll come in. Once we came into the country, it's been nothing but incredible. Like at the airport, there were just dozens of people with cameras. There was like a news crew there. There were huge banners to welcome the first foreign team back in for the spring season in 5 years. And everywhere we've gone, that's been the experience, is locals wanting to take photos with us, and locals, both Tibetan business owners, just really asking us to come to their restaurants and coffee shops and stores and things like that. And then also Chinese government officials really wanting to make this all work for us. And at the same time, not really, it feels like knowing exactly what the rules are because it hasn't happened in 5 years. So we're all learning together. So all that to say, well, it's been incredible. It's also been frustrating. It's been slow. It's been hard. And we're, a solid 2 weeks later than we normally would be on our Everest expedition. So while I'm having a great time, I don't want to paint like this perfect picture. There are changes I hope happen here to encourage foreign climbers and foreign tourism. A lot of the government officials we're meeting with say that's a big goal of China, to reintroduce foreign tourism here. And I'm excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, and while you've just been in base camp for a few days, you're moving on to ABC tomorrow. There's teams that have already summited from both sides. Ropes have been fixed to both sides of the summit. So, while the delay isn't critical for the Alpenglow team, it certainly is quite a delay from a lot of teams, especially Chinese teams on the north side and the south side climbers that have been, progressing up the mountain for weeks, almost months now.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. It is a wild, I would say, psychological challenge for our clients, but also for our guides to be here at the very beginning of our expedition, just starting to acclimatize to 20,000 feet, when this is the traditional summit window. May 15th to May 25th is the most popular time to summit on on Mount Everest. And the vast majority of expeditions will be going home, going back to beaches, going to families, all the wonderful things that summer brings. And we need to keep our head in the game, for we might have a long season ahead of us still. So that psychological piece has been really challenging, and especially for me, right? I have 13 years on the mountain to fall back on, where my brain tells me this should be happening now, this should be happening now. A great example is one of my favorite acclimatization hikes that I use here in base camp. We always do in April when we're here, and we walk across this frozen river and then do this like wild climb to 6,000 meters. Well, it turns out on May 14th, the river is no longer frozen. And like we had to spend, it was a day and a half before we figured out how to cross the damn river. And that was one of the first times I was like, oh shit, like it's different. Another example of that is we have this big white pod dome that we eat our meals in and hang out with loads of couches, an espresso machine this year. It's a pretty special place because we can drive all the way to base camp on the north side, so we can have some creature comforts. Without using helicopters or anything ridiculous like that. And we usually have 3 heaters inside that dome. And the first night, we had to turn all the heaters off except for one little cabinet heater for a massive 10-meter dome. And that was the second time that I was like, oh, it's like 15 degrees warmer because it's the middle of May, not the middle of April. So I'm learning. I'm trying to like use all my experience, and so are all the guides and Sherpa, but also realize that this is different and we need to adapt.
But at the same time, I'm familiar of many expeditions where um, teams are acclimatized, weather windows are good, and the rope fixing teams haven't made it to the summit. And so to have ropes fixed to the summit on both sides, obviously you're on the north side, but to have ropes fixed already to the summit, that takes that out of the equation, and not having to time summit pushes with rope fixing, finishing, and those factors. So maybe a little silver lining there for you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, things are progressing on both sides. It was great that the day we landed in Tibet, we found out that the Tibetan rope fixers had gone all the way to the summit, fixed ropes, said the route was in fantastic condition. And so there's no stress on that side. You're absolutely right. And on the Nepal side, the rope fixing to the summit felt about a week late, but it's really kind of
Hmm.
normal if you look historically over a decade or two instead of the last couple of years. And so that side is opened as well. And commercial teams have begun to make summits on the south side. We've had some like really cool successes that are fun to talk about, like Kami Rita getting his 29th summit, the most of any human, totally unbelievable, with a huge smile on his face while doing it. And Kenton Cool, a good friend of mine, making his 18th summit, which is the most of any non-Sherpa, and also still enjoying it and doing it in good style. Those two, along with another 30 or so climbers, kind of snuck in the day behind the rope fixers right before weather kind of like crapped out. And so now is this interesting time on the mountain. And we're, of course, just following along through the Sherpa grapevine and social media like everybody else. But, where teams really are antsy on the south side and want to be done. And so are making pushes in what is now really subpar weather. But these are the dangerous times, I think, because it's not weather where the wind's blowing 150 miles an hour and there's no question you can't go to the summit. It's winds blowing, 40 to 60 miles per hour, 60 to 80 kilometers an hour. It's temperatures, they're not colder than -30, but they're not -20 like we'd like them to be. They're more like -25, -28. So there are these windows where you can, if you're willing with your risk tolerance, you can make the summit. And if nothing goes wrong, you get to come down and tell your like happy story. But if anything goes wrong, there is just no buffer to going from a successful summit to a shit show. And from what we heard yesterday, 50 climbers tried to make the summit. Turned out the wind was too high and they all had to turn around at the Hillary Step. And the Hillary Step is only an hour from the summit. So that means two things to me. One, any of the clients who attempted that, they're done. They won't try again. So they all failed for their season. Two, and maybe more importantly, if you turned around an hour from the summit, it's because things were really, really bad. And so we won't hear for a day or two how many cases of frostbite happened, how many injuries occurred. Fatalities we hear about right away. No one can hide fatalities anymore, and that's a good thing. But, you know, each year the Himalayan Rescue Association treats hundreds of cases of frostbite on the south side of the mountain, most with Sherpa and workers, and it kind of goes unreported. And that's where I think we need to be focusing our attentions in these going in these marginal windows. There's a lot of risk.
Yeah, and just slim margins. I mean, that's when cutting edge alpinists, people climbing on their own, can make their own decisions. But when the guided teams are pushing through those conditions, not late in the season, it's not like there's no time left. It's quite early. In fact, I think you just said, May 15 to May 25 is a common window for summits. So kind
Yep.
of wild to hear such aggressive, movement on the mountain.
Yeah, and there is no more like, we used to be so proud of our weather forecast being so much better than anyone else's. I'll still shout out the Alpenglow meteorology team is the best in the business, but it's, in the margins now. It might be 10% better, or we might get more regular forecasts that we can adjust to, or we might get longer looks at good windows and things like that. But everyone's got weather now. So it's kind of inexcusable. Like, you know, to be going up on these days where we just know the winds are going to be high, when we know the winds are going to drop come the 19th or 20th, it's a little interesting. But I do understand as well, it's a balance with crowding, right? So there's also a lot of risk if you go on the best day with 250 people when you can go today with only 50 people. So they're really hard decisions, and that's part of what makes Everest so dang challenging. I'm certainly not sitting here saying like, I know the best and safest day to go to the summit of the mountain on the south side. I'm not there. I don't have the like kind of rhythm of what's happening, but I'm certainly just watching like, you know, me and all my guides here in Sherpa, we kind of wake up like each morning to check our phones and like hear what happened. And I don't love that. Um, yeah. At the same time, you mentioned a really interesting point, kind of that idea between guided clients, non-professional climbers, and professionals. We have heard thus far, one thing worth maybe mentioning, like it's incredibly unusual that there have been no deaths on Everest yet this season. It seems due to a lot of reasons, mostly because of the late start. Not so much the South Side also had a late start because of the icefall was so difficult this year. Um, So unfortunately, I think that will change. But the only kind of bad accident potential we've heard of is just yesterday, two Mongolian climbers apparently have gone missing high on the mountain on their summit push. But they were, I'm not sure of their level of professionalism. I assume they were professional climbers because they were attempting without oxygen and without Sherpa support above base camp, or perhaps you could say above the ice fall, because suddenly they were using the ropes and ladders through the ice fall. Um, but we'll find out more about what happened. Hopefully, it's hard to imagine they're alive still now that they've been missing for 2 days. So my thoughts go out to their families. But I do think, and you've heard me say this so many times, Sam, that there's a place in our sports like to take really outsized risk. As long as we're doing that as individuals, we understand those risks, and we're not trying to offload those risks onto our staff, whether that's Sherpa or mountain guides. So while I don't know the history yet of these two climbers, I hope they were just total badasses making the attempt of their lives. And yeah, so we'll hear more. But that's the only accident to date on Everest.
Well, yeah, hopefully all is well with them. It certainly doesn't sound good, but we're thinking of them for sure. And that kind of wraps up some news from Everest.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sam. Lots more news to come, I bet, in the upcoming weeks. I'll continue to lose my voice, and we'll continue to have big adventures up here.
Your tent might get more yellow depending on where you are on the mountain, or blue.
Yeah, they're going to go blue, Black Diamond Blue. Today's podcast is brought to you by Alpenglow Expeditions, a Tahoe-based guide company with an international reputation. In its 20th year of operations, Alpenglow leads the highest quality expeditions in some of the world's greatest mountain ranges, from California's High Sierra to the rugged Himalaya. Alpenglow runs more than 40 international expeditions per year, as well as offering a full menu of guided ski and climbing courses throughout California. Join us and experience the Alpenglow difference. Amazingly, it seems like this might be one of the better Wi-Fi connections I've had while recording, and I'm in my tent at 17,000 feet on the north side of Everest. It's crazy how good the cell signal is here.
And you're just on cell, not even a Starlink or
Yeah, no,
any
Starlink's not allowed
Wi-Fi.
in China, and our BGAN satellite systems, which are allowed, are really slow. But we have 4G unlimited data from a cell tower a quarter mile from base camp, kind of back where I was saying where they stop the tourists. That's
Yeah.
where there's a big military kind of setup, multiple hotels, and cell service. It does go
Wow.
away as we leave this camp. There were rumors that they might be installing towers up at Advanced Base Camp and Interim Camp, the next two camps. It turns out that was kind of an experiment 3 years ago, and they have not continued the experiment.
Hmm.
Which for now, it is interesting. I am the most connected human being I probably know, and I spent a lot of time on my phone here, kind of working on logistics. But even with that said, I'm kind of looking forward to that moment when the team has to switch off and can barely get a WhatsApp message out or an iMessage out, and there's going to be a little more like looking across the table at your tent mate instead of at your phone. So I'm kind of looking forward to it when we move up tomorrow, and it's going to be a real shift.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like you can't disconnect until you're forced to disconnect, and that's what you
Right.
really appreciate about the adventure. Um, but it's ironic that you have to force it by not having service to really do it, even though that might be one of the best things about a true expedition.
Yeah, absolutely right. But it's definitely funny coming from me. I've spent 20 years trying to increase our communication ability on the mountain. And now I'm like the old curmudgeon guy who's like, "Hi, hey guys, how about we put away our phones and play hearts?" It's a strange position to find myself in. But it's also, we just have this fantastic team of people who have been waiting so long to get here and have strived so hard to make it happen. And I just want to suck every moment out of it, and enjoy being here with these people.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, you've seen Everest change over the years. When was the first expedition that you participated on Mount Everest? And I guess I would also ask the first expedition in the Himalaya for you.
Yeah, so I came to the Himalaya for the first time as soon as I graduated college in 1997. But in that first trip, I was climbing on 6,000-meter peaks and doing a big trek. In 98, I started guiding here, but really the same types of things treks and 6,000-meter peaks, then built up to running things like Ama Dablam expeditions, a couple of attempts on Pumori, things like that. It wasn't until 2007 that I and Alpenglow finally had like a group of clients that wanted to go to an 8,000-meter peak, so one of the 14 tallest peaks in the world. But I didn't think I, as an expedition leader, had the experience to run that on my own. So in 2007, I wanted to climb on Cho Yu and reached out to Russell Bryce, who was the owner of a company called Himalayan Experience and a total legend, one of the original guys who decided that we could take non-professional climbers to the tallest mountains in the world. He's a fully certified Kiwi mountain guide living in Chamonix, and he kind of created this industry along with a few other climbers. And that whole period, actually, a little shout out, is documented really well in a new book called Everest Inc. by Will Cockrell that just came out. And I'm part of it. I'm biased, but the last 25 years on Everest have been fucking wild. The idea that an industry and a for-profit like business could come out of keeping people alive in one of the absolute harshest environments in the world is pretty fun. It certainly shaped my life. And this book chronicles these like just legendary badasses and all their warts as well as all their talents that made this possible in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. So check that out. But Russell was one of them. And I went to Cho Yu with him in 2007, and we just totally connected and decided to start working together. And he was no longer climbing at that point, but he was kind of like base camp expedition leader. And all I wanted to do was climb. So joining Alpenglow and his company, Himalayan Experience, and kind of our two skill sets just worked incredibly well. He became my mentor on the expedition leadership side, and I became his like little energizer bunny climber that would always be up on the mountain, fixing ropes, working with Sherpa, carrying loads, working with clients, just being up every day. So that was a long answer. 2008 was the first year I was invited to go to Everest as a mountain guide with Russell. But 8 days before we left the United States and Europe, China closed the north side of the mountain. We were planning on climbing on the north side even back then. China closed the mountain because they wanted to bring the Olympic torch to the summit. Uh, and so my very first season, it was so devastating. I thought this was my one shot to go to Everest, and here the expedition had been canceled 8 days before, and clients had lost so much money. The expedition companies had lost so much money. So that then meant I had to wait until 2009 for my first time to actually summit Mount Everest, and I did it from the south side. Russell and I decided, and especially Russell decided that at that point the Chinese weren't kind of like good business partners, which is funny to have all this history now. So he moved his operation to the south side, and I came with him and summited for the first time in 2009.
All right. So Cho Yu in 2008, you'd never been on an 8,000-meter peak before. Is that correct? And
No,
your
Cho Yu
first
in
time was,
2007. And
sorry,
yeah, I'd
2007.
never been on an 8,000-meter peak before. And that's true for almost all mountain guides. Their first time on an 8,000-meter peak will be while working, hopefully within an infrastructure of a lot of other skilled, experienced climbers who are kind of like mentoring them in that process. But most mountain guides aren't going to be able to afford to go to 8,000-meter peaks unless they're working. So Alpenglow is a great example of that. This year on the mountain, I think we have 8 mountain guides, and one, it's kind of his first time working into the Himalayan big mountain guiding. He's loads of experience on 6 and 7,000-meter peaks around the world, fully IFMGA certified, and now working into this. And with 8 guides, if somehow it doesn't work out, there's still a lot of strength and power in the team for his clients to have the best possible experience. But so yeah,
Oh,
so
it's
for
cool
me,
to
2007 Cho Yu, 2008 spring was canceled on Everest, but in the fall I went to Manaslu and summited Manaslu, and then 2009 I finally went to Everest on the south side, summited with my clients in that spring of 2009, and then have been on Everest every year since uh, until COVID.
And so you've guided, many summits of Mount Everest. You've also climbed Everest on personal expeditions, attempting Everest and having success without oxygen. What is kind of your overall journey on the mountain looked like? You've climbed on both the south side and the north side. We'll dive into your opinion on climbing exclusively on the north side now in a minute, but just kind of give us a brief overview of expeditions you've guided and kind of what your journey on the mountain has looked like.
Yeah, brief is not my talent here, but so 13
30
years,
seconds.
13 years total. I think that breaks up to like uh shoot, six on the south side, seven on the north side. Um I've summited 8 times, including once without supplemental oxygen. For 2 years, I stepped back from guiding, even though I was still expedition leader of Alpenglow's teams. But I stepped back from guiding and focused on my personal goal to climb without oxygen. Unsuccessful in 2016, successful in 2017. Um, and of the all the other expeditions I've been guiding and or expedition leading or both. And so focusing on helping others to get to the summit of the mountain. So obviously non-professional climbers. Um, as you know, Alpenglow has really pretty high standards for who we take on the mountain. So I've been really lucky to work with primarily good climbers who have earned their way to be there and feel more like competent teammates than, say, someone just being dragged to the summit, which I think is what the mainstream media kind of describes on Everest a lot of the time. And that does happen, but that certainly hasn't been my experience on the mountain. Um, I loved the South Side. I was on the South Side from, like I said, 2009 until 2000 through 2014, and in some ways, those were my like golden years of Everest guiding, where like I was summiting sometimes 2 times a season, sometimes 3 times between Lhotse and Everest in a season. I was the only Westerner for a number of years to be invited to rope fix with the Sherpa team. So the Sherpa really run the rope fixing, but I had a skill set that they thought could be additive, especially replacing old shitty anchors, place some bolts on the mountain where they needed to be, built a lot of new, just structure to the rope fixing system to make it safer for the increasing numbers of people on the mountains. And so, yeah, those years were just incredible for me as I was learning so much and climbing with my friends and also having success with my clients. But during that time as well, I think I went through the icefall, the Khumbu icefall, which is kind of the most dangerous section of the mountain on the south side. I went through it 38 times. 2 times, I felt like I legitimately was close to not coming home because of accidents in the icefall that I was involved in. And I think I helped dig out bodies 3 times in the icefall over those 38 times or over those years on that side. And that was something that constantly weighed on me. I was as guilty as anyone else of telling myself like this is just Everest and it's okay and it all works. But as I started to like take more and more leadership, Russell finally kind of bowed out of the business in 2012, and Alpenglow started running expeditions completely on our own without Russell's kind of like partnership. Um, and it just started to weigh on me to think about like Russell's career of 25 years on the mountain. If I did 25 years on the mountain, there was no way I couldn't have worker fatalities in the icefall. The numbers just don't allow for it. And when there's as a mountain guide to think about a risk that is completely avoidable by climbing a different way, in this case on the north side, and yet absolutely guarantees I will have worker fatalities and those families that I'll support for the rest of my life as an expedition owner, like to think about that, it just became too much. And so starting in 2013, I started trying to sell the north side of the mountain instead of the south side. I had a lot of Sherpa along with my expedition doctor who said the north side was just so much safer. And looking at data in the Himalayan database, that was absolutely true that in the modern era of climbing, the north side is just dramatically safer for workers. I think there's been one Sherpa fatality in the last 25 years on the north side versus, I'm going to make up a number, 75 or 100 on the south side. So I started trying to persuade my clients to go back to the north side. But people were afraid of what had happened in 2008, of all the money that was lost, and the fact that I think in the era of social media, no one had really been on the north side. So there was no way to kind of like research the north side as a client. I just couldn't sell it. where that switched was 2014, the icefall avalanche, which I was still on the Nepal side for that. And I think 19 Sherpa were killed in one avalanche in the icefall. Again, we had had this near miss type of accident over and over and over again, or we had lost one Sherpa, or three Sherpa, or four Sherpa. But when 19 were killed in one fell swoop, that broke through. That broke through potential clients' mindsets, that broke through the mainstream media understanding of the mountain. And finally, if there was any silver lining to that accident, it was that we could finally say to people, this is why you should go to the north side. And they listened. So finally in 2015, Alpenglow Expeditions and I were able to bring a team to the north side and begin establishing ourselves here. 15 was a horrible year with the earthquake. We ended up not summiting, but we had no fatalities because even though the earthquake was just as big on the north side as the south side, and it was one of the wilder experiences of my life to experience that, the way the mountain is shaped, we don't have things falling on top of us, avalanches and rockfall. So there were no fatalities when 23 were killed on the south side in the earthquake, purely because of avalanches and rockfall falling onto camp. So while 15 wasn't successful, we ended up shutting down our expedition, supporting the Chinese decision that they wanted to focus resources on their towns that had been damaged and people killed. So 15 wasn't successful, but then we were able to come back 16, 17, 18, 19, and just have incredible experiences on the north side. How was that for
It's
short and brief?
interesting. Yeah, it was pretty good actually. It's really interesting. You talked earlier about Will Cockrell's new book, Everest Inc., and I haven't actually gotten to finish the book, but I've started it. And, hearing about some of the history of the commercialization and the guided parties climbing Mount Everest, a lot of the early guided parties took place on the north side of the mountain. And it seems like, in the last 15 years is when that switch to the south side really took place. Maybe, in 2008, that the closure really kind of was the impetus behind that. But it's kind of interesting to hear and then know the history about, so many early guided expeditions taking place on the north side of the mountain as compared to what we've seen in the last decade and a half. How do
Yeah,
the
that's
two
right.
routes
And also
compare?
just a lot of people don't know, but in the early 2000s, the time when Russell Bryce was really active, along with IMG, International Mountain Guides, and Eric Simonson, both on the north side, in the 2005, 6, 7, before the closure, there were more summits and more people on the north side than the south side. The north side was just considered really obviously by the expedition leaders that it was safer. So why would you take the risk of the south side? And it's just interesting how completely it changed with the closure and kind of with the business impetus, I think, of having a, a, a reliable partner in the Nepali government for running expeditions versus, I
Yeah.
mean, it's just honestly true, the unreliable partner of China in terms of running expeditions in Tibet. I completely understand why people chose the South Side, but if I put my business brain on, we should be on the south side. If I put my
Yeah.
mountain guide brain on, we should be on the north side. And you know, my little shout out to Alpenglow. It's we're run by two IFMG mountain guides, me and Logan Talbot, and we we challenge each other regularly when maybe one or the other of us feels like our business brains are getting in the way of our mountain guide brains. And yeah, that's why we're here. And it certainly has been challenging from a business perspective, but I'm glad we've stayed true to that. And it's interesting. I've had a couple of people ask me just in the last week. Obviously, I'm very loudly shouting out the benefits of the North Side, and a lot of people are interested in asking questions. And one question I keep getting, which is a fair one, is like, well, if you and everyone else keeps saying how great the North Side is, isn't it just going to turn into the South Side in terms of numbers? And that's where I think the important differentiation, like, we should remember, is like China is trying to take seriously management on this mountain. Now, the negative side of that is frustrations we have, like with getting here in the first place, so being delayed a week for a permit, or right now we're hoping to be able to ski on the mountain while we're acclimatizing down low, and the Chinese think skiing might be more dangerous, and so they're questioning whether they will allow us to do that. So there are challenges, to their level of regulation. But the positive side is they're sitting here today with, 50 climbers on the mountain, and they're saying we will never, they've already set limits. They've said no more than 300 foreign climbers ever in a season. And that's, 10 times what they have this year, but they're planning ahead and putting regulations in place. They're doing the same thing with trash, the same thing with human waste, the same thing with no diesel generators. They're putting rules in place today for what they expect will be a busier mountain one day. And that's what gives me confidence. That's the same thing I see in the US in mountains or in Europe or even in places like Argentina now, is like thinking for the future and making sure the infrastructure is here and the rules are clear, so that we don't turn this place into something we're not proud of.
So the regulation is different. The objective hazard is different. How do the technicality of the routes compare? Are they pretty comparable?
I,
Is there a benefit to someone climbing on the south side just from a maybe easier aspect?
yeah, I mean, of course, we've already talked about the benefit of knowing your trip's going to run on the south side. So there's no permitting issues. I need to apply for permits here 6 months in advance. So I need to know my team 6 months in advance. You could apply today for a permit to the south side and go to Mount Everest on May 15th with no red tape or difficulties. So that's a big benefit. The the trek in many ways is more comfortable, and maybe not more comfortable, more beautiful. You're walking through these incredible Sherpa villages, seeing this culture. It's green, it's lush, it's wet. Whereas here on the Tibetan Plateau, it's quite dry. And we're obviously driving to base camp. In some ways, that might be safer for our health. Everything's really hygienic over on this side. We don't get sick nearly as often. But this is something very special about the trek on the south side. And then in terms of routes, the north side clearly is dramatically safer. We've kind of talked about that. Basically, we always climb on ridges on the north side. So anytime something falls off, avalanches or icefall or rockfall, it's not that we don't have them. It's just they fall away from us since we're climbing on the high point. And almost the entire route until Summit Day on the south side is in a valley. Do you like my little diagrams I'm making with my hands? You're climbing the bottom of a valley. So everything that falls down, rockfall, icefall, avalanches fall onto you on the south side. We've heard, perhaps already a dozen rockfall injuries and helicopter rescues for Sherpa working on the Lhotse face this year on the south side because it's so dry and so many rocks fall down. And, most people don't even hear about those things. But those are the kind of injuries I want to avoid. But with that said, you asked about advantages to the south side. It tends to be a bit warmer since you are in those valleys. You tend to have quite a bit less wind. You're also on the south side of the mountain instead of the north side of the mountain, and we're in the northern hemisphere. So, south is warmer.
Sun.
Yeah, exactly. More sun, less wind. Um, and then difficulty wise, most people feel like the north side is a bit more difficult on summit day because we have three technical rock steps. So we're in crampons on fifth class rock. We have fixed ropes. We have, lots of things to help us. But it is more technical climbing. Personally, I love that. And we don't shy away from that. We tell our clients that, we're trying, we want people to come here ready. They should not only have multiple 6,000-meter summits and a 7,000-meter summit and an 8,000-meter summit. They should also have put their time in crampons, going to places like Uray if you're in the US, or going to places like, basically anywhere in the Alps if you're in Europe, and doing ice climbing, and also just as much kind of like scrambly type terrain. I think the High Sierra or the Tetons or the Alps are perfect places to prep for the north side of Everest, because you do these routes that are kind of like glacier approaches. So you're wearing crampons and then rock. And it's not difficult rock, but you need to be able to move efficiently over thousands of feet of rock and not get exhausted because of that style of movement. So while a route is still primarily hiking, non technical, there is more of that scrambly terrain. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've seen out of Alpenglow clients is a passion for climbing, not just looking to check a box. And so many Alpenglow clients, they work towards their goal of Everest and then they continue climbing. And that just
Mm,
shows that they are passionate climbers as opposed to people just looking to, check that final box of Mount Everest and hang up their crampons, hang up their ice axe. So, yeah, it
yeah.
sounds like
I,
that route fits them well.
yeah, absolutely. I try not to. pretend to look into people's souls and judge their like purity of reason for climbing Mount Everest. And whether it's a bucket list, it's a, they want a good story for the cocktail hour, or it's a, deep passion for climbing that came from their parents and grandparents before them. And I'm not saying you're saying that either, but like, I think people have
A
lots of
little
different
bit.
reasons to climb this mountain. And I don't try to judge the validity of them. But what I do expect is that they will put the effort in to be, like I said already, a competent teammate. And that is very different than just showing up and trusting that the infrastructure around you is going to keep you safe, happy, healthy, and make it easy for you. No one's making Everest easy, no matter what the media says or what our pretty websites say. Everest is fucking hard and it breaks people no matter how much money you spend or which team which great expedition leader you choose to go with. And so like that's what I expect of my people, is that they come in having built the experience to be ready to be broken. In fact, one of the things we talk a lot about, one of the biggest boxes I want to see checked by a client before they come here, is actually that they've failed on a mountain before. That they, this whole idea that maybe is popular now of like, failure is not an option. Like, it's bullshit. And so one of the things I'm hoping by asking people to climb all these mountains in advance of coming to Everest is actually they've failed. They've been stuck in a storm and gotten the shit kicked out of them. They've had huge winds that just made it impossible to go up, no matter how good and talented and strong they are. Or they've had stupid politics get in the way, whether it's in Ecuador, where we've had some, uprisings recently where people just can't get to the mountain, or it's China, where it's one of the hardest places to get to in the world. But like, learning to fail, understanding that it's okay and life goes on and the experience is still powerful, like that gives me so much confidence in a person that they're going to be a strong teammate for me up high when things get really, really hard. So, it's a funny thing to shout out, but like Alpenglow, we love to talk about failure.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important factor of climbing in the mountains. We all know it. We know it well, and it speaks to a person and how they respond. So, one of the reasons you're able to be on Everest this year, the only reason you're able to be on Everest this year, given the challenges that the Chinese government has dealt you, is Alpenglow's rapid ascent program and the pre-acclimatization that allowed you to arrive, in country on May 7th. When did pre-acclimatization kind of enter your brain, and how did that potential kind of what sparked that idea in your head that that was a potential option to apply in the 8,000 meter world?
Yeah. So rapid ascent, is obviously this entire system of being able to move faster in the mountains at high altitude mountains. And a huge part of that is with pre acclimatization at home using hypoxic tent systems. And the company we work with is called Hypoxico. So you'll often hear us just talking about it as like Hypoxico training. Um, but where it started for me, kind of a lucky moment in my career, combined with like a need that I had, which was essentially throughout the 2000s, I was spending 7 to 8 months a year on expedition. I founded Alpenglow in 2004. We had no local US permits, so I could only guide internationally. And where Alpenglow really found its niche was on expedition peaks. So in Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, Nepal, Tibet, places like that. And so those trips were long. A 6,000 meter peak trip was generally like 16 to 20 days long. A 7,000 meter trip was 21 to 28 days long. And an 8,000 meter peak trip was, a month and a half to 2.5 months long. Every Everest expedition was 2.5 months long. And I was loving it. I was running my business off a satellite phone while living in a yellow tent on these mountains, running every single trip we did. But I was loving it, and it was also starting to wear me down. And I was recognizing the things I was starting to lose, including, personal relationships, family bonds, a feeling of community in Tahoe was almost impossible. People were like, oh, there's that guy who, we see once every 4 months. It's hard to have relationships that are really built on like trust and, being able to help each other out when you're gone that much. And then my business was suffering. It turned out it wasn't reasonable to continuing to grow Alpenglow while on an $8 a minute satellite phone from a yellow tent somewhere. Um, and so there are all these personal reasons I had for wanting to spend less time in the mountains, but not wanting to do fewer expeditions because I just love the experience and believe they're so powerful for the clients we were working with and for me and my guides. And in 2011, someone I mentioned in the news segment, Kenton Cool, this British climber, had gotten somehow this Samsung deal, I think it was, to be make the first live cell phone call from the summit of Mount Everest with this new technology that Samsung had. But for some reason, there was this problem of when he would be able to get the phone to when he could be on the summit window. And so he needed to go really quickly. He needed to do the whole trip in less than 30 days, when at that point, Everest expeditions was 75 days long, 2.5 months. And we all thought it was crazy. And Ken was like, well, I got this new thing that ultra runners are using to acclimatize before they go to like the Leadville 100, and I'm going to pre acclimatize at home. And he did it. And this is the first use of pre-acclimatization that I've heard of in the tallest mountains in the world. He did the trip in 22 days or something like that, made his live phone call from the summit to the CEO of Samsung. And I was like, whatever that was, I need that. And so I immediately went home, contacted the company, got a system, started playing with it, played with it by myself, kind of like guinea pig style for the next year until the fall of 2012. When I was like, this works. I've done a load of blood work on myself. I've talked to countless ultra runners and, you know, Mexico City, like soccer players, different people using these systems. And decided to kind of guinea pig a group of clients on Makalu because Makalu never used to be guided because it was so either you had to go very slowly for weeks on this trek to get to the mountain, or you had to heli onto the mountain, but then you weren't acclimatized. So we decided to pre-acclimatize a whole group with our expedition doctor, fly them directly to 19,000 feet. So we literally had clients coming from, Austin, Texas, and New York and Boston, sea level, direct to 19,000 feet, with our doctor ready to like save lives if necessary. And everyone did fine. We ended up not summiting the mountain that year, but we had 6 clients, 2 mountain guides, and no one had acute mountain sickness or AMS or altitude symptoms to the point at 19,000 feet that they couldn't continue the expedition. We were like, this works. And so from then on, I was all in. We started shortening our 8,000 meter peak trips and requiring pre acclimatization, then our 7,000 meter trips, then our 6,000 meter trips. And we've now seen a lot of other companies kind of jump on the bandwagon, which is great. But a lot of them still do things like they have a regular trip, doing a 70-day trip, and then they add a 30-day trip. And back when we experimented with that a little bit years ago, and we found like it just doesn't really work. The team has been there for so long. It's kind of anti the hot shots that come in and want to do it quickly. The bonding doesn't happen. The kind of like camaraderie that I think is so important for when things go wrong on a mountain. And then the second part is rapid ascent. The reason we call it rapid ascent, not just pre-acclimatization in a hypoxic tent, is because it doesn't really matter how pre-acclimatized you are if you then show up and your logistics suck and everyone just has to sit around and wait because of the tents aren't there, or the Jeep breaks down, or the heli logistics aren't there, or the weather forecasting is terrible, so you get stuck in a storm and get the shit kicked out of you, and then you have to go and recover in base camp for a week and try again. So I see it as this really holistic system. And the reason why everyone has to be in the same system is every single decision is made to make sure we don't get slowed down after everyone's worked so hard to pre-acclimatize.
And so the system it shortens the window to get you to the base of the mountain. It's not, I mean, I'm sure there's some advantage to your rotations on the mountain, but for the most part, it's making the approach essentially to your base camp or to your advanced base camp faster, in the matter of, taking it from weeks or even a month down to 2-3 days. And so it's not really changing what you do on the upper mountain as much as it's changing how you get to the mountain.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's all about the early part of the expedition that we're shortening, both the approach, like you mentioned, and then usually on these big mountains, you would roll into base camp and really spend like 1 to 2 weeks, or at least 7 to 10 days of sitting in base camp, letting your body catch up before you start doing the fun part, or at least the fun part for me, which is the technical climbing, the real climbing that happens above base camp. And so that was the part that was like the whiskey drinking and card playing that just I never loved. lots of people out there love it, and there are lots of teams you can go drink whiskey and play cards with. Um, that's the part I wanted to shorten. So really, we're cutting kind of like 2 to 3 weeks off the beginning of the trip, and then we fall back into a pretty traditional acclimatization schedule on the mountain, with this idea though that we're going to make fewer mistakes than most teams do, or have more backups to our logistics than most teams do. A great example of that is like the number of really strong Sherpa we're supported by on this mountain. Enables us, because Sherpa gets sick too, but instead of when we lose Sherpa to getting sick or needing breaks or things like that, instead of having to pause, we have enough power to continue working on the mountain and continue moving upwards. Same thing with our mountain guides. Our ratios are really low with our fully certified mountain guides, so that we can continue moving even when our mountain guides get sick or need a break. And so it's things like that that continue maybe keeping us a little tighter, a little faster than most teams. But it's not about pre-acclimatization. Really only helps us in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the trip.
Getting to base camp, and here you are, ready to move up the mountain.
Here we are. I mean, we came in with 22 foreigners and 14 Sherpa to the base camp at 17,200 feet. We did it really quickly, basically a 2.5 day drive across the Tibetan plateau. And, everyone felt great. The very next day after arriving at 17, all of our groups tagged at least 19,000 feet. So essentially they're 4 or maybe 5 days from sea level to 19,000 feet and doing great and able to, I have many, many memories of coming to base camp in the first few days, just, wondering how everyone's going to like struggle through the pain and suffering. And that's the part we've been able to take out, which then allows us to move more quickly, but also just to have less chances of getting sick in other ways, because our body's just fighting altitude in these early periods of the trip. We're able to focus on the other parts of climbing and staying healthy and continuing to move, which is the plan tomorrow. Our Sherpa actually left yesterday for advanced base camp, so they're 2 days ahead of us. Tomorrow, half of our group move up to advanced base camp, and the second half the day after. As we get higher in the mountain, we really like to split into smaller groups and start working as kind of like little pods that can take care of each other, support the different pods, but also just continue to strengthen those bonds that are so important as we get higher on the mountain.
Awesome. Well, you're a busy man. You've got a lot going on. Today is, I think, a rest day for you, which probably doesn't mean anything different than a work day for you. But we'll let you get after it. And thanks for taking the time to chat from Everest Base Camp. All the best on your movement up the mountain, and we're looking forward to following along.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to get to tell a few stories from the old days and talk about today as well. So I appreciate it and look forward to the next catch up.
Absolutely. Stay tuned for more info from Everest.
Whoop, whoop.
Thanks for listening to episode 4 of The Duffel Shuffle. Despite some technical difficulties and scheduling challenges, we're stoked to bring you real-time info straight out of base camp. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, rate us, and leave us a review. It's incredibly helpful in getting our show out there. We'll be back with episode 5 on May 28th-ish, and we hope you'll tune in.